Zeitgeist, meaning spirit or mood of the time, is the film of the time. Produced as a personal creative project, it was made available on the internet and quickly became a global phenomenon. Its comprehensive coverage of the facts behind religion, 911 and the finance system caused such an explosion in popularity that Google's video counters reached their limits at 50 million views. In October 2008, the second film, Zeitgeist Addendum, was released, covering the banking system, its negative effects on humanity, and designs for an alternative, new and improved future. Peter Joseph, director of Zeitgeist and Zeitgeist Addendum, talks with us about his reasons and inspirations for creating both films and his hopes for the future of humankind. Hi Peter, thank you so much for finding the time to talk to us today. I know you've had a really busy schedule while you've been in England. Obviously we're here to talk about Zeitgeist, Zeitgeist Addendum.
Thank you for having me.
It's fantastic, we're so pleased about that. First, before we kind of jump into Zeitgeist, I'd really just, if you could just tell me a little bit about yourself, what you do, your background, and why you started this project.
Well, as a commercial producer in New York, it was very unfulfilling for the most part. And it's you know, you walk the line, you have your job, as anyone does. Yeah. And ultimately, I've always had other aspirations creatively, so I always engaged in other projects, such as filmmaking projects and off-Broadway projects and multimedia projects. So I had a pattern of doing this independently on my own in New York, even though it was never really for money or anything like that.
Yeah.
And as time went on, I started to realize that there's a lot of really terrible, sinister issues going on in the world. And I decided that it would be to my advantage and to the advantage of society, and actually to my own satisfaction, to do something that would have not just an artistic element for the sake of art, but something that would actually be beneficial to the system, because art without conscience in a lot of ways is kind of meaningless, I've come to find. I think as time moves forward, you look back at what contributions of art have really endured. They actually have a great presence to them as far as how they relate to the human condition. So as you go back to J.S. Bach and the church, and all of these elements that come forward with art that has a relevance to it outside of just for the sake of art. You know what I mean? Yes. So a painting not for the sake of painting, for a painting for the sake of actually communicating something about humanity and the social condition of the time, perhaps. So Zeitgeist was an attempt to combine my artistic interests with some social cause, so social interest. And I think what triggered it was 9/11, because of how catastrophic the event was, and then as time went on, information began to come out about how ridiculous the government's account of the story was, and then you began to see who actually gained from this as time went on with the wars and the corporations. So my initial trigger for Zeitgeist, the original movie, was 9/11, so to speak. And then as I was approaching this to create an artistic work representing it, which, by the way, the original Zeitgeist was shown as a multimedia work in Lower Manhattan initially, with no intent to be an actual release at all. It was shown for 6 nights for free to an activist group that came in, and then it was thrown up online afterwards, and then it just happened to erupt with interest.
Exploded.
Which, by the way, put me in a very precarious position, because I didn't own the rights to a certain amount of it, and it was all friends I had made in the movement and things like this, so I had to retroactively go through this big mess. So anyway, but as far as the film itself, religion was always very interesting to me ever since I was a child. I was never raised in a really rigid religious environment, but I was around it to a certain degree. My families were very Catholic. My parents were not particularly religious, but
I was raised as Catholic also.
Right, and I went to a Catholic school for a little while, so I got to experience this. And as a child, there was always something strange to me. Like in one class, I'd be in science, and then in one class, I'd go to this little church situation. And even at a young age, there was a strange dichotomy to me that didn't make any sense. And not to say that all religions don't have a value. They actually all very much do historically. And there are a lot of people that see the film, they get the wrong impression about what I'm trying to say about religion. In the first film, I deal with the history of religion. That's sort of a history that no one really talks about, because it's not the established representation.
Pattern.
Right.
I must admit, when I first watched that myself, I was absolutely flabbergasted when you show how the Christ religion and how many others came in under very, very similar situations, and that absolutely knocked my socks off, because I never knew anything like that.
Yeah, the dying and resurrecting God-man.
That's right.
Has been going on for millennia, for ages, and it's a symbolic rebirth. As early pagan ideology, it's where you're born again. All these
goes right to the Druidism and the solar cross.
Oh, absolutely.
The birth of the sun.
It's age old, exactly, and it has multiple symbolisms apart from the sun as being its core. Like astrotheology is the terminology used to describe this stellar and solar element that has basically been transmuted and transformed into the historical religions that we think these attributes are actual history, when if you look far enough back, you see that it's basically pure allegory. And that even though there were certain characters that emerged historically, say in Christianity, there probably was somebody that fulfilled some role that this Christ character was assumed. But by the time the Bible came to fruition, the Christ character was transformed into a totally mythological figure. So there really isn't a historical element. There is no there's no documentation of a historical Christ. And that's very challenged, of course. Of course.
So where do we stand with the Bible? Because there's so many books in there, talking about the Christ. So I guess you must have miffed off a lot of Christians when you put this out there.
And they misinterpret, I believe, because even if he didn't exist, it doesn't matter. It's the message.
It's the message. It is the message, yes.
They shouldn't be... I don't believe... Religion has a propensity towards materialism. They don't call it materialism, but they hold on to something and they really can't break away from it. And that's the definition of materialism in my mind. So to think that, just because this character didn't exist, this demeans the whole thing is not necessarily the case. If you want to drive for pure superstition, then yes, it is the case, which of course I don't advocate. I think philosophy is much more important than, obviously philosophy. Superstition is a derogatory sort of term, but when it comes to these notions of the man dying for your sins, I think these are misconstrued. I think there's no real relevance to it, and it's based on this sort of control mechanism that you're guilty the moment you're born, and he died for your sins thousands of years. Yes, it's distorted on one side, and then there's also kernels of truth that speak to the human condition. Love the neighbor.
So everything kind of gets mixed up together.
It does, and it's to speak a little bit more about that. The Christ character is very much composite because there's a lot of dichotomy in his rhetoric. In one passage he says, "I don't bring peace, I bring the sword. I want to have your neighbor against neighbor," and then another passage it's love thy neighbor and love your enemies.
So it's a bit of a mixed message, isn't it? Really?
Well, because it's a composite text, and that makes sense. You find these dichotomies, these yin and yangs, happening all through lots of different God-men that have existed. So that's why it's even more proof that it's
on the research that you've done with all these different characters in history who've come in as